Hey everyone, Effie here. Today I'm going to show you how I made this card using our 4x6 Daisy Duet set. This set features a cluster of two large daisies that are really fun to color because the petals are larger in this image. To get these images onto my watercolor panel, I did a bit of heat embossing using our rose gold embossing powder. I also used a masking technique to fill up half of my panel with the daisy cluster image. So I started off by rose gold heat embossing my first daisy cluster on the bottom portion of the panel. So after I embossed that first cluster, I masked off that cluster and then stamped the daisy cluster or daisy duet again right above that cluster to get half of my panel filled up. Now our daisy duet image is fairly large, so you only have to stamp it twice to basically fill up your panel about 3/4 of the way. If you watch my previous video of me coloring my daisy duet background panel using my color burst. I colored it in yellow and orange or marigold color burst. I basically stamped and masked this panel the same way, but I just kind of stopped about halfway. So if you want to see how I masked that panel, I just did the same thing here, but I just stopped halfway. So I'll link that video in the description box below if you want to see how I did that masking, because I actually did not get that portion on video for this card, and I apologize for that, but I will link to the other video so you can see how I masked my daisies. For today's project, I'll just be doing some quick watercoloring using my new watercolors that I got. These are Shinhan watercolors. I actually got them while I was abroad, and I got them at a really good deal. So I wanted to test them out, and my Daisy Duet cluster was a really great way to kind of see how they would flow on my paper. So I can't remember the colors that I use. I apologize for that. But for my daisy petals, I'm using one shade of blue for my first base layer of color. And then for the darker, more intense color that you see me putting down here, I use a nice deep purple. When I do floral watercolor painting that feature larger petals, I usually like to use two colors to paint because there's a little bit more interest. I like a little bit more contrast in these types of images. So if the petal is larger, I will usually use two colors that are next to each other on the color wheel. So I usually do, blue or purple, or if I'm going with more warm tones, I'll go with orange or red or pink or red, or even yellows and oranges or yellows and reds, because when you blend the yellows and reds together, they make a nice orange. So you get nice three-tone look to your floral. And usually with watercolors, you get all these different shades of one color that, come in a set or that are available to you. So I encourage you to experiment with all the different shades that you have in your palette. All right, so I'm gonna go forward and explain what I'm doing in this video instead of rambling on. So before I start painting, I apply some clean water to the area that I want to paint first, because I'm going to be doing a wet on wet watercolor technique, which is going to help me get a better blend. For the first base layer of color that I'm putting down for my daisies, I'm using more of a cobalt blue hue, and I'm just kind of going up about 95% of the way on my daisies with this first base layer. I'm leaving a little bit of white, and after I blend that cobalt blue out just a bit, I'm going to go in with my second layer of blue, and I'm using more of an ultramarine shade for the second layer. When I paint my florals, I always start from the inside out. So for that first layer, I started from the inside out with the cobalt blue, the light cobalt blue. And then for this ultramarine, I do the same thing. I start from the inner portions of the petals and I blend that color out. But for the ultramarine, since this is a little darker than the cobalt blue, I just blend that out about 3/4 of the way. I don't want to cover the cobalt blue. I want a little bit of that lighter blue shade showing up. So after I put down that second layer of ultramarine blue, I go in with a deeper purple to add a little bit of shading to my daisies. For the deep purple, I just go in at the corners and I blend it out just a little bit, and this is going to add a little bit of that two-tone interest to my daisies. Once my petals are colored, I'm going to go in and paint the leaves a nice light shade of gray. If you don't have gray, you can use black watercolor and just dilute it with a bit of water to get a nice gray. For the leaves, I didn't do the wet on wet technique because the areas of the leaves aren't really that large. So I just applied a little bit of the pigment to the inner portions of the leaves and I blended that color out all the way to the tips of the leaves. Next, I used a Prussian blue color to add a bit of shading around my daisy clusters, and this is just going to ground my florals. It adds a bit of interest to the work when you use this shading technique to ground your image. So for the shading, I painted the same way that I painted my florals. I wet the area first and then I added the Prussian blue. And after I added that first layer, that base layer of color, I kind of go in with a deeper Prussian blue in the inner corners. So this is going to give it that illusion of depth. I forgot to paint the centers of my daisies, but I do it later on, which you'll see. But once I finish painting at this point, I set the panel aside to completely dry. And then next I'm just going to stamp my sentiment. I believe the sentiment is from our Peony Notes set. I stamped it and I embossed it in our rose gold embossing powder. Then I took the large die from our double stitch rectangles large die set to add just a bit of stitching to the edges of my panel for interest. This is where I painted the center of my daisies using the darker ultramarine blue watercolor paint. Next, I'm just going to cut strips of our strong double-sided adhesive. These come in sheets, and I'm just going to cut strips and then apply those strips behind my watercolor panel. And then I'm going to mount that watercolor panel onto a side-folding A2 card base. Once my watercolor panel was mounted onto the base, I embellished my project using our clear rhinestones. Our rhinestones come in 3 sizes. These are crystal clear gems, so they take on whatever color you adhere them onto. So they look really, really gorgeous and they look like dewdrops, but they have the faceted edges instead of the dome edges like our clear dewdrops. And I just used some Ranger Multi-Matte Medium to adhere them onto my project. The card is now complete. I hope you all enjoyed today's video. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.